I'm not sure if I should stand here because my voice fluctuates, but in any case, I will try. My name is Makoma and I'm from Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg, which is an environmental justice organization. And thanks for inviting us to share. But the unfortunate part is that I'm not from government, no Richard, no Vish. So I think we're just going to give a civil society perspective of what we understand government's response or approach to water, climate, and a just transition. Firstly, please allow me to generalize, and the generalization may somehow also be factual. My generalization is that we have governments that care much about deals and profit, and that they have no interest whether citizens have access to basic services and not living in hunger. Is a sustainable future at the top of our priorities as citizens of this country? That is something that is a work in progress, but I don't think that the sustainable future is part of our priorities as a country based on what is happening around us, particularly that it seems like we don't care that we are facing a threat of climate change, and that impacts negatively on every one of us, including finally degrading the environment and destroying the planet that we live in. On paper, yes, the South African government has ratified and made commitments to a number of conventions and agreements and around reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And recently, they have ratified the Paris Agreement, or they have agreed to the Paris Agreement, and they also have come up with the nationally determined contributions as to what South Africa would be doing to ensure that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and there's no negativity that is being impacted on the citizens and of people of this country. But then these nationally determined contributions are not just coming out of nowhere. They have to talk to the plans, policies, and legislation that we have in the country. On the Paris Agreement, we have just realized that they have actually made that commitment, but also coming up with nationally determined contributions, of which some of us in this room were part of shaping, though the end product is not what we really wanted to see, because the end product is there on paper. It may be how good, it may also detail that we need to have a just transition to a low carbon development. It's on paper, but implementation, is that happening? We have, in the recent weeks, been engaging on the climate change bill, making input and submissions as to what would we want to see us doing as South Africans to ensure that there's no greenhouse gas emissions that are manufactured continuously and finally causing global warming and climate change. Right now, there's discussions around the integrated resource plan, which is a plan for electricity generation in the country for the coming years, and I think the cap has been put up until 2030. But then all this also, there's a review also of the National Development Plan. And the National Development Plan also emphasizes on Chapter 5 around the environment and how we can be able to move towards a low carbon development. But in all the good stuff that is being done by the government with the participation of civil society organizations, of citizens in this country, it is important that we create an enabling environment, and that enabling environment, for me, I've seen it missing. It's not there. It's not there even if we talk about just transition to low carbon development. We still see authorization of coal mines we still see pollution of rivers, we still see pollution of the atmosphere, and in that case, that means a just transition is something that it's a dream, but we all have to work towards that. And most of the time when you talk about a just transition, there's an issue that is so around us that we always talk about, and that the unions, the labor movement is also being critical around as we talk about just transition. Where are the jobs? Where will the jobs come from? And what do we do? But because there is not that enabling environment to ensure that we have jobs and we have sustainable development towards a low carbon future, this has been one thing that has been very critical amongst us. But as we are approaching national elections next year, we're going to hear more about job creation. And what would job creation entail? What would the political parties that will be contesting elections telling us that how are they going to create jobs? And I think this is something that we really have to continuously talk about, or that we have to continuously engage in, and also demystify much of the information that is out there that is very negative towards a low carbon development. The enabling environment that would need us to have an institutionalized way of moving from business as usual towards a just transition, and making sure that we have sustainable development and have a low carbon future. In our institutions, we just see business as usual, whether it's within our communities, whether it's within the educational institutions, whether it's within the political sphere. It doesn't seem that like we want to break with business of usual of how we do stuff, but at the bottom of all this, it's the economic policies that we have in this country, from the past policies that we've had, and we're not sure even if the National Development Plan would actually work or would create an enabling environment so that we have a just energy, we have a just transition, breaking away with business as usual. What we find in our institutions, particularly in the learning institutions, it's like business as usual, it's embedded within the educational system. Young people or students are not geared towards a future that people can be able to create jobs, a future that people can be able to share amongst themselves. I think the education system is also geared towards business as usual, where profit takes a priority rather than the welfare of the people. And the funds available to enable an environment towards a low carbon future, or an environment towards a just transition. There may be funds. We don't know what the Department of Trade and Industry has got plans. I may not be familiar, maybe other people are familiar, but are there funds that would really assist? If we talk about job creation, is it kind of job creation where would we have to go and seek employment at private companies that are not even local companies, these private companies who actually are transferring their carbon emissions in the country whilst they're doing good in their own countries? I think these are some of the stuff that we really need to look into if we really would want to say our government is responding positively towards breaking from business as usual towards a just energy future. We need to find ways as to what other forms can we be able to use so that we move towards a better future. And the other forms of funds being available, I think this is something that we have seen in the past, particularly when it comes to the renewable energy independent power producers, whereby ordinary people and particularly workers that have grouped themselves together wanting to have a socially owned renewable energy independent power producers could not do that because there were no funds. I mean, for you to be able to register for to be an independent power producer, whether as an individual or as a cooperative or as a community, there were huge amounts of funds that were needed for you to be able to do that. So that was not the case. So environment need to enable people to be able to create jobs. The environment we need to have an enabling environment that would also assist us to be able to have a low carbon development. It's our collective responsibility. It's not government only that has got to do that. And if we leave that to government, we know what politicians are. They are for profits. And unfortunately, those who aspire to be politicians, you need to take heed and lessons from what is happening around us so that you become part of creating a future that is not going to destroy the planet and life on Earth. I think there are positives that are coming from the government, but particularly on paper, but in implementation, it's questionable. But then if that is, implementation is questionable, it's up to us to say what do we do. If we really want to have a situation where we create a future that would be of benefit to us, it's up to us to be able to engage in various processes taking place right now. And various processes, I may know only of those within the energy and climate space, but I think there are many other processes that are taking place. There's been so much information shared around water mismanagement in this country. We know what's happening in the energy sector, and we know that if we don't really act as citizens, if we don't really influence and shape policy as citizens, we are doomed, and we also are complicit to that. But I would want to say that for us to say the government should have a positive response to our situations, it's us who's got to persuade them, we have to critique them, and we have to stand up for our rights, because we've got a beautiful constitution that actually enables us to be able to become players and also be able to shape our future. Thank you.
Shall I start talking while you fiddle?
Yes.
Good afternoon, comrades. Well, first, let me agree with everything Makoma said. I agree absolutely entirely, and I'm also going to generalize somewhat. But before doing that, let me just note that there are some real important things that happen at local government level that we shouldn't ignore simply because of what's happening at the national level, and similar with provincial, although Province is in a bit of a funny position with climate change in that it's not really clear how much impact they will have, but some of the most progressive strategies have come out of provincial governments, including in the Western Cape, on paper. So, yeah, there's a lot more going. But then in national government, we've also got a National Planning Commission. And I'm not sure if this is part of government or not. It's a planning commission that is convened under the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. So it sort of is part of government, but the commissioners aren't employed directly by any government department. All they can do is basically advise. So it's an advisory thing. And the National Planning Commission certainly seems to be more forward-looking, more holistic in their approach, more progressive than what we see from government on balance. And they're doing some work at the moment to try and elaborate what a pathway to a low-carbon economy might look like. So that is a government initiative, but we're not clear how much it will actually influence what government does, but it does seem to be one worth trying to use. But then national government, as we mostly think of it, the departments, we've got various departments and they're not all on the same page. So DTI, the Department of Trade and Industry, is the sort of perhaps the most regressive of the government departments on climate change. And then we've got DEA, where there are some people trying to do a good job, but where we have been subject to, someone mentioned earlier that old slogan, talk left, walk right. Which still operates, although government seems a little less intent to talk left at the moment. It's certainly still walking right. And on climate change, it's a situation where it's like, yeah, we pay lip service to it, we talk about how important it all is, put policy in place, but we fall forward with what we're doing anyway, regardless of what it does to the climate. So it's kind of talk response, but not walk response. Something that particularly resonated with me from what Vish said at the beginning is that we do need a strategic convergence amongst activists, not just tactical alliances. And I would actually apply that even to the idea of a red-green alliance. If we could move beyond the idea of just getting allied on particular campaigns or whatever, which is good, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think we can do better with this idea of convergence and actually bringing red and green issues together into a collective articulation of what's golden or whatever we want to call it. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of generalizations. I will be using the integrated resource plan that Makoma mentioned as an example of where government is, but I'm going to do that really quickly because I don't want to get stuck into the technical details of electricity planning. And we mustn't forget adaptation. I tend to focus on mitigation a lot, but we absolutely need both mitigation and adaptation. We're not going to make it, even if we are radical in our reduction of emissions, we're not going to make it without really concerted adaptation initiatives as well. I just saw a presentation yesterday in Iowa in the United States. They're down to less than half of the soil depth of what it was when they started commercial agriculture back in the late 1800s. And that wasn't fully industrialized then, but they had soil depths were 2.8 meters or something, and they're now down to like 1.2 meters in terms of their productive soil depth. So, you know, these are things that have to be addressed, and I'm not very au fait with. So I do get the impression that there's some good work being done under the adaptation strategy and those initiatives, but I'm not close enough to evaluate it. Suffice to say that government is not ignoring that, and it deserves attention. The other thing about the talking left, walking right, or saying one thing and doing another, is coming back to mitigation or emissions avoidance and reduction. South Africa loves to, on the world stage, talk about how important it is for the industrialized or the rich countries to be leading in mitigation of climate change. This is from the same party, the ANC, that in its foreign policy discussions lambastes the West and the North for this, that, and the other things that they're all doing wrong. And yet it comes to climate change and they say, but these are the guys that have got to fix it for us. Just doesn't really fit together. So we have a lot of schizophrenic or two-faced, Janus-faced responses on climate change. The Paris Agreement itself is presented as a sort of panacea. Oh, well, we've got the Paris Agreement now, that'll be okay. No, it won't. In fact, there are those people who say that the Paris Agreement does more harm than good by providing such a panacea. That's a debate for another day as to whether it's doing more harm than good. But certainly the way it is referenced by our government and a number of others is not useful, and it can be obstructive to doing what we need to do. For example, our nationally determined contribution to climate change response, which on the front of adaptation is real ambitious and good, on the side of mitigation, it is just avoidance, fudging. There's a huge range. If our emissions were at the top of the range, they would be way too high. If our emissions now were at the bottom of the range, that would be cool, but it's impossible because the range starts well below where they are now. But by the time we get through to about 2030, even the bottom of the range is way too high. So we have this band of commitment under the Paris Agreement that is almost meaningless, and potentially more dangerous than being meaningless, because people spend a lot of time running around talking about what it means rather than getting on with implementing. Government treats the status quo, not just in terms of government, but in terms of our economic system, etc. It basically treats it as acceptable, despite all the critique it has and acknowledgement of the shortcomings. When it comes to climate change response, any kind of change from the status quo is considered to be challenging, difficult, problematic, as though the status quo were actually a good thing that needs to be protected. And yet we know what all the shortcomings are. So this idea that anything, it comes down to Jeff Radebe, Minister of Energy, when he launched the IRP for public comment. He used the term just transition. The first time I've ever heard someone from the Department of Energy in South Africa use that term. It's not actually in the integrated resource plan, unfortunately, although it does talk about transition. Just transition only came in the vocal remarks to press, but it's framed as leave no one behind. And again, there's this idea that the status quo is serving us well, and in dealing with climate change, well, we mustn't leave anyone behind. We better take it slow, right? Because we might leave, like people aren't being left behind left, right, and center, and it's only the idea that we've got to cut down on coal that now gets us concerned about leaving anyone behind. So we really need to get government to understand just transition a little better than is reflected by Minister Kadebe in that speech. I'm going to fly through some stuff on the IRP. You will have the presentation, it will be circulated afterwards, so you can look at the details at your leisure. I'm really just wanting to show you a couple of trajectories of emissions into the future, so you can see kind of where we're at. So there's a few introductory things. One of the things that illustrates where we are on government's position on climate change, this is coal use, 1990 to 2014. From 0 to 80% for all energy. So this is an indication of the share of coal in all energy supply. This is South Africa, this is the G20 average. So the group of 20 rich countries, of which South Africa is one, average about 30% of their energy comes from coal. South Africa is upwards of 70%, even through to today we're still at about 70%. The interesting thing about that is that South Africa will say, well, we're very dependent on coal, so we have challenges mitigating. You have to take that we're a developing country. Can't. When developed countries look at that, they say, guys, you're using 70% coal. You've got a massive mitigation opportunity there. It's going to be good for your water, good for your air, good for your people. You can cut down on that coal use. So look at it from one side, the domestic side is kind of big burden, very dependent on coal, 70% or more of our energy. Oh, it's going to be tough for us. But from a different perspective, big opportunity for climate change response. And that's just a picture of the, that's a picture of all energy, and you can see how much coal does there, over 70%. The IRP only deals with the electricity, so it's not all of our energy system. Mostly from coal, we use a lot of coal, we use a lot of liquid fuels. IRP only looks at the electricity system. One of the problems is that we're not looking at the energy system as a whole, so it gives us a whole lot of stuff. And in amongst the IRP table of contents, you've got CO2 emissions constraints, and that's what we're going to focus in on. But first, as a point of comparison, this little new book came out recently, and the Minister of Finance is quoted at the launch of the book saying, the positive news is there is no trade-off anymore between clean and least cost electricity. So basically, he's recognizing that the costs of electricity supply technologies have changed so radically that where we used to talk about, oh, well, you know, we'd like to mitigate, but it's going to add to the costs. There's a trade-off there. That is not the case anymore. It's now cheaper to go low carbon. That's acknowledged by our Minister of Finance and in the IRP. In this little book, they look at a least cost electricity, they look at the energy system as a whole, but they look at the least cost electricity pathway which they've modeled for us. This is very similar to the work that was done by CSIR before. One of the authors used to work there, so some of it might look familiar. On the left, you've got greenhouse gas emissions, on the right, you've got water. And the line down here, this is the emissions, or the water use, from the least cost pathway, using the same assumptions as Department of Energy. So it's not like they say we've got different information, they're using the same information, but when they do the modelling, they don't put a restriction on renewables, they don't force in extra coal, they just model least cost. Least cost pathway, here we are around about here, so our electricity emissions are over 200 megatons per annum. As Medupi Kusile comes online, they will go up. But so the CSIR model accepts Medupi and Kusile. Not that they say it's good, but they just say, well, this is government seems stuck on it, so we'll put it in the model. But they don't put the coal IPPs, the extra 1,000. So, as we go to least cost, emissions are down to 50 megatons by 2050. It's not saying we can't go lower, this is just the least cost pathway with what we know about technologies at the moment and without making optimistic predictions about what might be done in the future. Okay. This is the electricity component of, in the white paper of 2011, it's called the peak, plateau and decline. And it's, I said it's the range. So what they've done is they've taken the middle of the range, DOE did this, Department of Energy took the middle of the range, said electricity accounts for about half of all emissions, so we'll have half of the carbon budget. So there's our commitment. It's the same as in Paris Agreement, so you can call it the nationally determined contribution as well, because PPD, same thing. That's where that sits. So we've got a commitment that our emissions for electricity will not go below that. Oh, that's very useful, isn't it? And then this is water use just from electricity supply, generation. So the washing of coal for export, that water isn't included in there. The various other forms of water use in energy, such as for Sasol liquid fuel production, this is just the electricity generation plant water use, because that's all that the IRP looks at. So that gives you an idea of what could be done in the least cost pathway model by those guys. And this, actually, you can look at that later if you want. I'm going to push on. There you see the peak pattern decline versus NDC, and they've shown it as a cost saving. So they're saying that rather than the commitment, coming down to this will save us costs. This is a line that comes from a model by the International Energy Agency, and it suggests what they think South Africa should be doing. Okay? That's considerably below least cost for electricity, but just to put it into a bit of context, international people, without assuming that South Africa should be considered exceptional and be given a lot of extra latitude, says if we're going to bring emissions down according to the Paris goal, that's where South Africa's emissions from electricity should be. There's a quote from Jeff, but I want to move on to the emissions because I've run out of time. This is previous electricity planning. So that orange line, once again, it's stretched over a longer time. So it looks like a slightly different shape because now it's 25 to 50, but it's the same line. It's just stretched out of it. And in the IRP 2013, for the first time, they put in a stronger constraint, that blue line. So they looked at bringing emissions down a bit lower. And yeah, so that's what is reproduced in IRP Update Report 2018. They don't show us emissions from the plan. They give us a lot of scenario modeling results, but they don't actually say the plan will use this much water, this much CO2. They haven't actually given us that. But they do say, oh look, we've introduced a carbon budget. That is the carbon budget. It is defined as 3 10-year periods, the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, and the carbon budget diminishes over that period. So let's put that line roughly into the previous lines. That's the new carbon budget. So they could say, are we being good? We looked at the carbon budget, we're looking at more emissions reduction than we were looking at in 2013. Just compare that with what's in the Bischoff-Nibs book. So we squish that back to 25 to 50, and we compare it with the least cost scenario, and putting them all onto one graph, you've got that. So you can see that you take that carbon budget, which is actually in 3 slabs, you put it as a line, and you compare the carbon budget with the least cost, and their carbon budget is going to emit way more than a least cost supply scenario. To my mind, that tells us pretty much where government is on climate change. They're offering us a carbon budget on electricity supply, and they haven't managed to make it reconcile with the least cost supply path. Have I got any time left? Am I done? Okay. You can put them all onto one graph, and you can look at the plan and a brief mention on the plan. So this is how they present what will be built over the period of the plan, which is now until 2030. They model to 2050, but the plan is only what we'll do up until 2030. So on the left, we've got coal, Medupi, Kusile, and yellow. They're considered stuck in the system, under construction still. They'll be coming on. And then 2 times 500 in the coal, that's the IPPs averaged out. It's not exactly those figures, but that's where they're putting the coal IPPs. And so when it comes to wind and solar, let's just enlarge that a bit. They've said, yeah, we're committed to some PV and wind. The yellow stuff is what's already under the power purchase agreements that have been signed, the 27 that were talked about quite a lot this last year. That's the yellow stuff. And then we just stopped doing renewables for a couple of years. We're doing some coal at that time. It's exactly the same time that the coal IPPs are coming. And then we'll pick up on coal on renewable development later. They tell us that they've smoothed out the development of renewables to be good for development of the industry. The industry see this, they say value of death. What the hell? You don't want us here, let's go and invest somewhere else. So we talk a good game, but this is the sort of thing we should be doing with our emissions. And that's on the website of the African Climate Reality Project, and that's where the cost fits in. So there's lots more that can be said, but for now, that's one indication of where government is at.
pick up, and I'm glad that Makoma and Richard have given us some more detailed policy observation, even comparison of where government is at, and that we are dealing with a climate crisis failed state. That's my starting point for my own intervention. The other point I want to make is that I want to try and explain why the government reaches back into the status quo, as Richard suggested, or why the government is still on a business as usual path. Why the just transition doesn't have substance in South Africa. It's a rhetorical device. It's part of the noise, a propagandistic noise coming from the state. I want to try and explain why there isn't that enabling environment, and to kind of focus more on the kind of agency that's required to confront a climate crisis failed state. Now, as climate justice activists, we have to take the climate science absolutely serious. We have to make sure that we are guided, we are informed, and the science is changing very, very fast. And I'm going to introduce you to two tools. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to is going to kind of look at the kind of global picture and then try to fit South Africa into that. So the planet is heating. And this is a carbon tracker from Oxford University. And basically it's saying that with 500,000 million tons, we had a 1 degree increase since the Industrial Revolution. We are now at 625,000 million tons. And with all the assumptions in their model, they tell us that by 2036, the current emission trajectory, current emission rates, we will breach 2 degrees Celsius. Now that leaves us with a very limited window, okay, if we were to use this model, to think about global aggregates of carbon and so on. We've got less than 20 years to confront what is possibly catastrophic climate change. This is a carbon tracking device by Carbon Tracker. They're based in the UK, and they've literally put together a grid of our planet. And you can go to particular cells on that grid. You can go to Cape Town and ask, well, has Cape Town heated since 1860 up to the present? And they tell us, yes, Cape Town has heated by 1 degree Celsius. You can go to the same map that you can hit on the cell for Johannesburg, and it tells us that since 1860 to now, Joburg has heated to 1.2 degrees Celsius. So beyond the big averages of a 1.2 degree increase in planetary temperature at the moment since the Industrial Revolution, when you drill down, you drill deeper into our local spaces, etc., heating is already registering. So, in terms of what I want to get at in this conversation, in trying to explain why the South African state is so useless and why it's failing and so on, we've got to talk about a thing called climate or eco-fascism, okay? Because we are heading towards the extinction of the human race and other life forms. And we've got to locate this class project of eco-fascism in the conjuncture of neoliberalism and the systemic contradiction of corporate and imperial-induced climate change. So in other words, it's not all of us on planet Earth that are committing global suicide, okay? There are powerful forces that are killing all of us. It's as simple as that. And we need to keep that in view as we struggle. The other points to make around our challenges for agency, and we're going to fight this monster called climate or eco-fascism that's poised to wipe us all out, are the following. The first is we've got to think about our theory of crisis. We've got to think about how we understand neoliberal capitalism, climate change as class projects, and we've got to think about imperialism today, not just as the US invading and all of that, but as imperial ecocide, undermining the conditions that sustain life. And we've got to think about class and popular resistance. Now, in terms of our theory of crisis, we really have to understand that our world is already in crisis because of financialization, okay? So the inequalities this has engendered has created a world in crisis. It's worse than the 1930s. At the same time, we have this complex problem of climate change, which is also caused by capitalism. The corporations that are extracting, that are selling, that are burning, and so on, carbon fuels. So you have going on right now a meeting of a crisis of neoliberalism and a meeting of systemic crisis tendencies. We have 150 years of carbon extraction and fossil fuel in the modern industrial context, and temperatures are moving up in a dangerous direction. Climate shocks are registering, and we are seeing the interlock of these crises. So the water crisis we've been talking about earlier on is interlocking with the climate crisis, it's interlocking with the food system, and so on. So in other words, we have a system that's going down a path that's destroying the conditions to sustain life. It is ecocidal. So we are at a new frontier, and as activists, we've got to keep all these dimensions of crisis in perspective. We also need to understand that within neoliberal capitalism, democracy has been weakened. The stick has been bent towards corporations. We have market democracies. These are democracies not responsive to the needs of people. And when we spoke about state capture earlier on and so on, this is consistent with this market democracy and the power it gives to corporations. At the same time, we are also seeing the rise of authoritarian forces. They're still committed to the market, they're still committed to globalization, but they are authoritarian. So there's a double squeeze on democracy right now. And so this is something we need to think about in terms of where we are, even in the South African context. We've come out of market democracy, we had Zuma's authoritarian squeeze, and we're trying to fix all of this. We've got a weakened democracy in South Africa. The other point to make is that there are two-class projects, if you like, shaping the world today around the climate crisis. The one-class project is ongoing carbon capitalism. More extraction, more burning, and let's go for it, right? So Trump has placed the United States at the front of the charts right now. It's eclipsed Saudi Arabia, and it's eclipsed Russia as the largest producer of fossil fuels. At the same time, and South Africa is in that game. At the same time, we have carbon capitalism. So we talk about carbon budgets, and we talk about all the technical planning, etc. And Richard has very cleverly exploded the myth of all that scenario planning and so on. But the point is this, is that it's still managing the same system that is reproducing this problem. In South Africa, we have both class projects dominating our trajectory, where we are going. And both these class projects are false solutions. They're not going to solve the problem. And that's why we're going to have business as usual. We're going to be marching on the same spot. So we really, both these class projects actually are, if you like, moving in a deeply reactionary direction towards eco-fascism. That is, seeing democracy more and more as a problem, that is increasingly trying to think of coercing the response to this crisis, increasingly thinking about a racist, nationalist narrative, and of course, willing to collapse ecosystems. So, South Africa is part of this world system, it is part of this imperial system, and it is managing both carbon capitalism and climate capitalism. And I'm not going to get into the history and so on because of time, but just to say that where we are right now, the United States has completely turned its back on the multilateral solution to this problem, and we have very weak solutions coming out of the UN. And basically, the Trump-based ruling class doesn't care about planetary life. So in our activism, in us organizing, in us resisting, we've got to recognize that part of the struggle is against this imperial ecocidal enemy. And so, to conclude with two last slides, we've got to come back to that question of our agency. If we are going to move the South African state and society beyond carbon and climate capitalism, if we are going to mobilize South African society to confront imperial ecocide, then we've got to aggregate power. We've got to build solid, popular, working class-led alliances. And we have to construct these alliances, if you like, in a way that constitutes power from below. So when we talk about food sovereignty pathways, we are building a new food system. That's what we are talking about. It's not the old style of left politics, we're going to smash the state and then we're going to transform. No, we are building the food system now. Similarly, when we talk about water commoning and claiming our rights, etc., and changing the water regime, pushing back privatization, we are talking about doing that now. We're also talking about recognizing the weaknesses of the working class. And the working class has a carbon fraction in it. It has an eco fraction in it. We also have precarious workers in our society. We have a carbon precariat, and we have an eco-precariat. And we largely have wageless majorities. Unemployment, according to the ILO, going forward, is not going to come down. It's going to stay high and it is going to grow. So in this context, we've got to think about all these social forces that we need to unite. We need to find these convergences around anti-systemic politics. We need to think about alternatives in a very deeply solidaristic way. It's not like you march on your own and then we come together. Your pain is my pain, and vice versa. That's the kind of solidarities we have to be building. We also have to really start thinking about a new kind of state. The state right now is not a climate emergency state. Everything we've heard about water and the drought is testimony to a climate crisis failed state. We need a climate emergency state, not that's modeling abstract stuff, that's building a new water system, that's creating the conditions for a new food system to emerge from below, and so on and so on. Ultimately, what's not coming through in the South African discourse around the just transition are systemic alternatives from people's movements. And we have systemic alternatives for climate justice, for the deep just transition now. This is not reflected in the NDP, it is not reflected in the IRP rethink, it's not reflected in the climate bill that has come to the fore. And so this book is for free and you can pull it off the web, but the point about it is that we as mass forces have answers. There are solutions now, and we've got to build a politics that can take this forward. My bet is not with the state, my bet is with people's power. Amandla.
Thank you, Vish. So we'll take a few questions and comments. We'll start with Imran and then Pat. Sorry, not Imran, Jubilee, then Pat, then David.
Thank you, gentlemen and ladies, for quite an interesting. Yesterday I was going through, I don't know if it was preparation for this occasion, the 2004 presentation that Earthlife made to Minerals and Energy, which was forecasting basically on what jobs will be created, what incremental change will be there if we basically move away from coal-based fire stations to integrating them with renewable energy. But the thing is that as I'm sitting here, I realize that in all of the discussions which are going here, we underestimate the word corruption in all of this. Because we are thinking that we're dealing with people who understood where they are coming from, at what level they need to take the nation, and at what development they also have to take the people that are involved. But that does not happen. I'll give you a practical example. We had forecasted that jobs will be created through integration and introducing renewable technology. That was not taken for. I mean, we had things like CDM projects, carbon trade, designated national authority, but that did not happen. But now, the question I'm asking myself is that Vishwas also touched on that in the sense that now we're having a double-edged sword, in the sense that not only are we facing the government in terms of basically mitigating against climate crisis, we are also acting against unions and neoliberal PE people, because they're saying, but we are just new mine owners. Why would you want us to discard mining, coal mining, while we just basically got ourselves into this new wealth that we got? So in this process, when I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, how is it that we're going to be transcending beyond these two parties and saying, guys, this is about basically mitigating against climate change? Because I mean, you can't fault the science now. I mean, we are seeing what's happening around the world. Natural disasters are basically heightened. So in this process, what I would like the two gentlemen is that how do we basically instill the notion that there is a climate crisis and we need to act against it?
Thank you, Maurice. I think, for me, it's scary that our government and our politicians are dragging their feet when it comes to climate change. And it seems like there is some reluctance in understanding the problems that we're facing. But I also think that Richard, you had a lot to say about this, but because we don't have time. And it's always a problem that when we deal with issues like this, there's never enough time. Where I thought we were going to start off was where we put all the alternatives on the table. If we go hydro, these are the pros and cons. If we go nuclear, if we go IPPs, if we go coal. And you mentioned, Richard, that we're using about 70% coal and that there are opportunities. But the question now is, opportunities for who? Because, I mean, I would dread a situation where it's still these conglomerates that exploit those opportunities. And Makoma, you also mentioned that it would be very expensive to go for the IPPs where they are expropriated to communities. But I think there's more work to be done there. We need to find out what are the best practices elsewhere in the world, how things are done, because I don't think we must leave it at that. It is a very expensive exercise. It has to be done convincingly. And I think we need to get back the power, our economic power. So I think that's what we need to look at. But like I say, it will be very interesting for me to understand all the alternatives that we have. And also, if you talk about climate change, a person on the street would tell you that there are better things to worry about because they don't understand the problem that is posed by climate change. Maybe we need to have some brochures, you know, so that we can, when we talk to people on the street, they must understand the situation that we're facing. You know, the globe is warming up, it's heating up, and if we reach that 2% wish, then I think we'll be in a big trouble. So I think though we have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. Devine. Yeah, Devine?
Yeah. If we look at the presentation of my two colleagues talk about the environment, at the moment we are facing criminal charges for protecting our environment. Like the mining companies where they just destroy the environment. If you look at the area where I'm staying in the Western Cape, towards Panellists, that is an area that is very, very beautiful between June upwards to September, October, where you get the patches of flowers, different type of flowers in the field, natural. It's not flowers that were sown by men, but it was sown by God. So the environment are so beautiful. And what the mining companies, the Department of Mineral Resources, they do, they just give out mining license to the foreign national companies to destroy our environment. We as activists, our life is in danger when we stand up and fight the government. But we are saying we don't want mining companies to come in and destroy what rightfully belongs to us. If we look at the IDP, and even if you put it down to the local government IDPs, they are not considering what we want, but they are looking into the multinational companies by making profit. And even the fisher folk in the Western Cape, in the West Coast, they can't fish like they did in the past. Because this mining activities take place on the shoreline. And if you look at the coastal lines of Africa, I always say we got everything that we see in other countries, we have in South Africa. But if we are not, and if you look at the Constitution, if we don't have the right to speak out and stand up and say freedom of speech, what will happen to this environment? So we need to put more pressure. I'm part of La Via Campesina, and last month we have a conference in Nicaragua about climate justice. But the knowledge of the knowledge of climate justice is so limited because we come from a background where we are just activists. We are not academics. And in the movement of La Via Campesina, there's not so a large number of academics they can come in and give us this lecture about what Rich did by saying this is what happened around the globe and this is how we can open up our mindset and broaden it to go back to our communities and fight the system. So it's very, very important that we need our academics to come in. Some people will say, no, we don't want academics. They put us in a certain way by saying we must think like that. But if we want to be successful in our struggle as activists, we need to bring up what the other role players to fight the system. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. So you next and then Period. And then Alex.
My question is to the panel in regard to the IPPs. Why NUMSA, for instance, is against the IPPs, and could this be privatization by the back door? Because this is what I've gathered on the media, that IPPs are kind of a privatization of energy by the back door. So thus maybe the trade unions like NUMSA would be opposed to it. And what is your view on the Democratic Alliance's position that ESCOM should be privatized, or certain sections of ESCOM should be privatized now?
Who you can answer?
Can we take two more? Okay, Burial.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the discussion is phrased on what government's approach has been to the climate crisis. But I want to also add how civil society has contributed to government's behavior. So, for example, the climate negotiations. We all know what little is coming out of that. We all know what a failure it's been. But come December and every organization is there. We're feeding that system, and we need to call it what it is. We need to take away the credit that it's been given. So that's the first thing, and the second. So that's the international, but also on the IRP. And I don't know if this is civil, because I know that all the contributions and all the public hearings have been really good. I know that you guys have said the right things, but how do we get then government to actually listen? Like, how do we discredit their process without harming us in terms of the IRP? Because if we discredit, then you're going to have like 5 Chinese coal mines coming up. So I think it's just that's my concern, is how are we as civil society, because we're so divided and because we're working in our little different silos, that maybe we are our own worst enemy, and we are causing government's strength to privatize, to do all the things that we're talking about.
Thanks, Burial. Annalise.
I've got my own little constitutional crisis, Vish. When you earlier this morning spoke about eco-fascism and you put it on here again, I had a moment of joy because I thought you meant green fascism, the other way around. So I would like if you could comment maybe on at least a philosophical thought about a new state of green fascism.
Thank you for your questions. And for me, it's from the questions that are coming up from the floor. We need much more time to talk about these things, some of the issues, and maybe in future have just kind of a whole day or 2 days talking about some of, particularly the topic that we just engaged on. It's known all over the world that as protectors of our lands, our water, our climate, our food, that we face continuous threats on a daily basis. And in the community talks about criminal charges against them for protecting their environment. There's so many other people some in this room, some outside of this room, who are facing continuous threats. Some are being told that your hours are numbered. Some are told that make sure that everything is okay because anytime it's tea time for you. But we can't keep quiet. We can't just let go and say people can do whatever they want with the environment that we find ourselves in. If anything is wrong, we need to stand up and say it's wrong. We need to put it the way it is. We should not allow any injustice take place on our watch, even if we face death. But we need to stand up. We don't have to be silenced by all the threats. All what we need to do, we need to raise our voices much higher, because we're not doing that for ourselves. We're doing it for the next generation. I'm glad that Comrade Vuyo from NUMSA is here. I think Comrade Vuyo can add much more on the question of the independent power producers. But in essence, as Earthlife, we are supporting NUMSA's stance on renewable energy independent power producers. When the independent power producers were introduced way back around 2010, 2011, we are one of those organizations, I think together with the trade unions, to say, yes, we understand the independent power producers, so why do you put coal-based independent power producers as part of the package? And we also were asked because of the externalized costs that are associated with coal. And we also were questioning that if it's renewable energy independent power producers, it should be socially owned. So that's why I was talking about an enabling environment for us to be able to just transition to a low carbon development. And when NUMSA took the IPP office to task, because when they wanted to register a cooperative of workers to be able to generate electricity, because these guys have got skills, though they're out of work, and we supported them. But what happened last year was really somehow a little bit embarrassing, particularly that you find a whole lot more of civil society organizations saying NUMSA is out of order. And NUMSA was not out of order. NUMSA is correct, it's still correct. There may be other aspects that we don't agree with them on, but literally I think the position that they have is a correct position, and that's a position that civil society organizations, community-based organizations should rally around, because we just want a just energy transition or a just transition to a low carbon development. Comrade can also also assist with ESCOM privatization. We have been critiquing, we have said there's mismanagement as ESCOM, it needs to be napped, and at the peak when we were raising mismanagement was around the Soweto electricity crisis, when communities in Soweto were running around to say there must be something wrong. We cannot be paying cost recovery of the loans that ESCOM had acquired on our behalf when we're not actually even getting service. And also that it came up around ESCOM Midupli and Kusile bills, when we also have said there must be something wrong. Who in his mind or her mind would put a record of decision for coal-fired power plants to be built in water-scarce areas? The water bank doesn't have water. In Kusile, there's also problems around water. And then we said there must be something wrong. But it also told us that the private interests were at play. It would rather go ahead, have the coal-fired power stations, and ignore the alternatives that are abundant. But we understand that you can't sell the sun and wind, and that's the problem. But then the other alternatives of generating electricity are not solutions to climate change. Nuclear is not a solution to climate change. Coal is not a solution to climate change. In fact, the interpanel Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group of scientists had actually pointed out that coal is a culprit on global warming towards climate change. So that's why all countries are required to really cut down on electricity generation by coal. I'll leave the others to my other panelists. Richard can also talk more about the Earthlife report on the contribution of renewable energy. But then clean development mechanisms, these are very nice terms that are put through to us. When somebody talks about clean development mechanism, we think of something very nice. But what happened, SASO, which is the biggest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in this country and actually in the whole of Africa, had applied for carbon credits using false information, and we had to expose them. And it seems like they're still continuing to do that and coming out as if that they're doing something clean, and they're offsetting their emissions with also other false solutions. So our health is at stake here, and even if they talk about clean development mechanism, it seems like it's a slow death. Our people's health are impacted, and Comrade Des, I think, can speak more about that. Thank you.
So there will be one more round of questions.
Right. Well, I'm not going to make this all about energy, so I won't get into a lot of what you said because our focus here is on water, and I agree with you, we need more time for that. So just trying to do it a little bit softly in between. The point I was mostly wanting to make around the IRP is that when government says, but now we're introducing a carbon budget, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And in fact, they acknowledge it within the text of the Integrated Resource Plan that applying the carbon budget they've got doesn't impact on how the model chooses technologies. Now, we wrote a letter to the Deputy Director General, the new Deputy Director General in the department, saying, are you guys really going to allow the Department of Energy to set a carbon budget for electricity? Somewhat embarrassingly, a week later, I heard from someone within the department, the DEA actually gave the DOE those numbers. So that carbon budget that is in there was provided, apparently, I was told this informally, it's not official, so people might deny it, but we'll ask DOE where the numbers come from. Hopefully they'll tell us, we got them from DEA, and then we'll go to DEA and say, what the hell are you doing giving them a carbon budget for electricity? Which means that they're ignoring cost-saving opportunities to reduce our emissions. So that carbon budget that is in there is a pretty meaningless thing. However, not all of the things that government does are meaningless, and I would take issue with the rather dismissive characterization of everything the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change does as being useless, but that is another big debate with a lot of many sides to it. But I do think we should be a little cautious about just dissing everything that comes under the UNFCCC, even though I agree that the Paris Agreement, you can see it two ways. You could see it as better than nothing, or you could see it as part of the obstruction to what really needs to happen. But then let's restrict that to that particular deal that was cobbled together in 2015, because there's a lot else coming out of the UNFCCC that we really need. Timberlane, yes, corruption is going to mess with everything. I agree with you. And how do we get a clear acknowledgement of the crisis and opportunities for change? Well, that is one of the key challenges, and to my mind, information needs a lot more focus here. There's in policy speak, they talk about incongruence of information. In other words, some people sit with the information and other people don't have it and they can't get it, and even if we use the Public Access to Information Act, we might not get all the information we want. So, and this applies to water to food sovereignty. I mean, what's happening to our soils? Do we have people measuring how much soil has been lost on some of our most agricultural lands? So we do definitely need a lot more information, and not to be fudging over the edges. There's a publication that came out recently called What Lies Beneath, underestimating the existential risk of climate change. and it is a scientific report on how the scientists have tended to downplay their findings because they don't want to sound alarmist. They don't want to be dismissed as being cranky scientists who are making alarmist predictions. So they kind of tone it down all the time, with the result that we've understated the risk. So getting more clear information on the table is really important. And in the public domain. So for example, in the climate change bill, it takes government's default attitude again, that information may be treated as proprietary and therefore the possession of companies that are holding that information, and that therefore, if that's acceptable, and that there may be cases where that information should be shared, rather than saying all information should be shared unless a company can prove why it would damage their business interests to have that information disclosed. So really the default position ought to be all information into the public domain, and the burden of proof to keep it hidden for any reason should be on the private sector. And I think that is just as important with the amount of water consumption, who's holding what water, what pesticides are being used in what agriculture, what the volumes of industrial fertilizers are that we're using in this country. Massive of this really important information, and 9 out of 10 times when you try and get it, oh, that's proprietary, if we tell you about that, our competitors will know what we're doing. I mean, like, so bloody what? If you can't run a business without us knowing what you're doing, then shut up shop. Leave it to other people to do. Just on coal, of course there is such a thing as clean coal. You guys must have heard about clean coal. And I had an insight recently. I know what clean coal is. We've got lots of it in Mpumalanga. It is coal that sits under our lovely agricultural farmlands, and in situ, that coal is clean and it stays clean and it provides a valuable service. It serves as a sequestration already there of massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions that are absorbed by biomass in the past, deposited geologically, transformed into fossil fuels, which is fossilized biomass. It sits there, it nicely underpins and holds moisture in this wonderful agricultural land in Mpumalanga, and as long as it stays there, it is clean. If we let them dig it up, we start making a mess with it, and it's no longer clean, no matter what end-of-pipe technologies you put on. So there's another thing we might challenge government with. The only clean coal is coal in situ. Don't try and tell us it's clean after you've dug it up and started doing stuff with it. It never gets any cleaner than when it is there in the ground. Just on the IPPs, I think Makoma said something about that. I would observe that a cooperative running a community-based and driven energy project is an IPP, an independent power producer. The key issue is the way in which independent power producers are being accommodated through a procurement process that panders to transnational capital and the private sector. So let's be a little careful when we say IPPs, because it basically means independent of ESCOM. Now most of us know, when we say IPP, we're talking about what's happening through the IPP office, but because we are also trying to figure out what would be good examples of community-based projects, things that are independent of ESCOM, maybe in partnership with local government, don't have to be particularly in bed with the private sector. So I just encourage treating IPPs as a big class, and then there's the IPP program as currently being managed under the procurement office, which puts a lot of weight on the finances. But the bigger problem I would suggest here is actually around financialization. And we've got it in the energy sector as a whole. It's particularly happening in renewables because that's a growth sector, and the private sector is trying to figure out how to get their piece of renewables. And for ages, you couldn't own the sun, you can't own the wind, so it was like, oh, well, we better go with the stuff that we can go get mineral rights and dig out the ground, and then it's ours, and then we sell that. That's how the private sector works. But the private sector has now come up with ways of, if you do the project finance in such a way that the energy winds up being owned by the private sector or the financial sector. So it's the whole challenge of financialization is also very closely linked to climate change and adaptation as well. So in agriculture, decisions on agriculture being driven by the financial sector, because if you're not going to either generate a certain amount of revenue return on your capital or generate a certain amount of gross domestic product growth, government doesn't pay attention. So it's this growing influence of the financial sector to mediate in what developments happen, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the more productive stuff in agriculture, that I think we really need to watch out for.
Okay, I'll just speak from here quickly. So whose problem is climate change, and how do we raise awareness and so on? So I think in all the analysis we've been developing as activists, in our campaigning work and so on, I think we're very clear about who's caused the climate crisis. It's the petro-states, it's the carbon ruling elites, it's the imperial carbon US, etc. So we can explain it. We know where this problem is caused and who's causing it. But the thing about the climate crisis is that it affects all of us. We all bear the brunt for its consequences. Okay? It's a great leveler, actually. So even if the rich can buy a borehole and they can travel, a heating planet on a planetary scale means there's no place for escape for anyone in the end. So I think we've got to keep that in mind. Now, the drought that has hit us, it's a challenge to our society, and we've been hearing about it, and we've been being activist about it, and so on. It's a drought that is a climate shock, and it's a drought that is testing all of us. It's testing the state. It's testing capital. It's also testing us as progressive social forces. Now, that is why, comrades, we are sitting here today. That is why we went to Cape Town and we launched this climate water charter process. That is why we had a drought speak out. That is why we had a hunger tribunal going back a few years and so on. Because in the end, we also got to use this moment to get organized and build mass power, build mass consciousness. And that is why we've invited all of you here to also talk about a water/climate justice charter for the country, and to work on a deeply bottom-up participatory process. Increasingly in our political language in this country going forward, we're going to have to be talking about South Africa before the drought, during the drought, and after the drought. This drought is a turning point. And if we do not use it effectively as progressive forces to shift society, we are failing. We should take our t-shirts and burn them. We shouldn't call ourselves activists, okay? Because this is the moment, and this is the moment to act. Now the point about eco-fascism. Now the most advanced thinking on climate change actually is in the Pentagon. So they've done all the scenario modeling and abrupt climate change and so on, and they've elevated it to a national security question and challenge, even in US foreign policy for the US state. But their whole approach to this is we understand it's a problem. They have the science, they know it's coming. They have an ecological conception of it. But they're going to police all of us. They're going to police zones of chaos. That's the eco-fascism. And Trump deepens that. It's all about lifeboat America. We can consume all the resources on the planet. We can pollute as much as we want, but we have the guns. And we will protect our way of life at all costs. That's what they're telling us right now. And successive American presidents have echoed that over the past 20 years of the UN climate negotiations. That's eco-fascism. Okay? But it's also so myopic and so irrational and so mad, because again, the United States cannot escape the climate crisis, the wildfires, okay, the hurricanes barreling through and battering that society, okay, the poor in that society understanding the squeeze of climate change more and more, okay. So the US is not going to escape this imperial eco-fascist politics. Inside the United States, there are forces of resistance rising. We saw them marching in San Francisco, the indigenous peoples' movements and so on. That's where we need to be building the alliances and so on. Eco-fascism also expresses itself in currents of green thought, neo-Malthusian green thought. So who's to blame for all of this? Population growth, okay? It's the people to blame for the climate crisis, for all the ecological crisis, etc., etc. But again, we've got to be very careful with the population argument, because you end up in a racist position, you end up in a neo-fascist position. Yeah? So some people have argued, and I've read this literature, short of sterilizing most people in the global south, we need to do A, B, C, D. I mean, this is the language they use. But you know, the demographic transition has shown that the wealthy countries have been able, if you like, to make that shift. And it's got to do with income distribution. It's got to do with development benefits and gains and who shares in all of that. And for the past 50 years, the global south has been oppressed by imperialism. We don't stand a chance to catch up with anyone in the West. It's a myth. Okay? So this question about population has to be thought about very, very carefully. It's mainly the darker nations. It's India, it's our own continent that have this, if you like, massive fertility and demographic growth. But we should be given the chance to go our way. My final point is this, is that, you know, James Hansen, the leading NASA scientist, kind of, you know, rang the bell in 1988 around the science of climate change. And successively, as he's gone to the UN COP negotiations, etc., he's increasingly has become more cynical. Because based on all the knowledge he has and all the grasp and command of the science that he has, his conclusion is that the UN multilateral process is a place of false hope. Okay? It's not providing us with the solutions. I'm very, very sorry. I mean, I think this is where there's room for debate. There might be some technical work coming out of it, etc., but that's not where the solutions are coming from for this big problem. And I think that is why we have got to build from below. The UN is not going to shift the South African state, okay? The ruling classes are not going to wake up one day in South Africa and realize we've got to solve this problem and we're going to do radical transformation. It's only going to come if we build power and push things in a particular direction.
Thanks, Vish. We had 2 more questions. Susanna, Hassan, Nazia. Okay, we'll have to keep them quick. Nazia, and then we can do
Thanks, Makoma. That was a great summary of exactly what we experience on the ground, of this disjunct between the governors and the people on the ground, of where everything is on paper, but in practice it doesn't really exist. So what can we do to get to a point where we can force the implementation? There are plenty of policies that are very good, and we found that in the case of the PHA campaign. All of the paperwork says densification of cities, preservation of peri-urban farmland. It's all on paper. How do we get to a point where we can implement this? And going along with what Vishwas says, it's not a case of smashing the system and trying to build something new. It's a case of building power from below and making sure that what exists in theory now becomes practice. So that build from below is very, very important. And so I just wanted to suggest that with all the expertise and experience, practical experience in this room, one of the roles that the PHA campaign plays is as a local laboratory, sort of think laboratory. So we have emerging farmers who are campaign members. We have UCT, UWC, CPUT students coming out to the farm all the time, and these are different classes: global citizenship, environmental humanities, all different aspects of the campaign, but we're trying to disseminate the lessons that we've learned in the campaign to the younger generation, because the youth is where it's at. We're the old fogies, you know, we're on our way out. But if we can't share our experiences, especially somebody like Makoma and Earthlife, who came from nowhere and stopped a freaking nuclear deal. I mean, there are groups across here, Tom and mine, who are all doing that. How do we disseminate those lessons? Richard, what you said about putting the burden of proof onto corporates to prove that their information must stay secret. This burden of proof, if we want the implementation of our Bill of Rights, so food security, PHA campaign, food security, you have to find the resources to go to court to get a judge to order somebody to do that. And one of the ideas about this constitutional change on land reform was the idea that maybe we could put a clause in the Bill of Rights that puts the onus on the users of the land to prove that their use is just and equitable. So perhaps in all our settings, as water users, maybe we as Cape Town citizens have to go to the mayor and go to us that is just and equitable. So the onus is on them. Vishwas, you give us great phrasing here, eco-fascism, imperial ecocide. Thank you. You are the master of vocabulary. We all need vocabulary. You know, we have these concepts, and you put it into words, and the fact that you put it into your publications and that sort of thing is very valuable. Your Food Sovereignty Act has been informing for the last year the development of a people's bylaw in the city of Cape Town. Because, as you said, Jane, what is the point of, or the role of a charter? The role of a charter is for decisions to be made on our terms. So if your systems don't fit with the principles in our charter, you've got to change your systems. So the experience of all of us in the room who have had to go through these legal processes and have had to endure their terms of public participation. If we have a charter, it says these are the principles under which you're supposed to work. And then we do it on our terms and we say your system is not fitting with what we've experienced, that your system doesn't work. We want it improved. Let's do it this way around. And so that we can be proactive as citizens in systems instead of them imposing decisions on us. And thank you for that. I think climate change is an excellent collective overview for all of our experiences here. So where people are saying, why would you spend time on climate change? I'm from health, I'm in public health. And for years everybody has said, why are you talking about the NHI? We've got TB, we've got malaria, we've got this, we've got that. Whereas actually an NHI system would address all of those issues. So if we go to the climate change principle and talk about the fact that we're addressing water from climate change, food security from climate change, all your administrative decisions in terms of that, thank you for that. It's a great sort of context to put us all under one roof, because there are a lot of us working in a lot of different silos, and we have to have this collective. And thank you for the work that you do in that regard, Vishwas. Thanks. Hassan.
Yeah, thanks. My question or points of discussion comes from a number of people here raising almost a point that reflects on their own inabilities, saying we need academics, we need this. And I actually don't believe that. I mean, what PhD and others are doing come from their own experiences. They read, they go to meetings. My sister there next to you, I see her every place where I'm active. She's in every conference. So clearly, when are communities going to believe that they have knowledge? Not like I'm saying. So I'm just saying that there are a number of groups that actually have a greater sense of confidence by the virtue of their own work, having studied, and come and share it here. But if you simply come here to say that, oh, we don't know, someone has to come and teach us, then I think we're in a bad footing. And then I think also, I know you praise Vish for the eco-fascism and others. The difficulty we have is how to make this a topic for every discussion on radio or on the street, etc. Because people are experiencing the small burden, they are experiencing it. So we're going to find both the language, conceptual language, but also language that can help us build our own power.
Thanks for the Jane. I think one of the issues that Musa has discussed as well, and I think the point that you made, Richard, around IPP, I mean, that point doesn't sit comfortably with me. Where you try to make a separation between the big foreign-owned IPPs and some other IPPs. For us, the resolution is that we reject all IPPs. We are for collective, social, public ownership of energy. And utilities must be run and must be in the hands of the public. So IPPs will support IPPs. Now, the witness of the challenge in the attempt we made as those against the IPPs. We made a correct move in attacking the IPPs and taking that matter to court. But I mean, not for calling for those IPPs to be socialized and nationalized or to be expropriated and made the property of the public. That's a shortcoming I can see in that particular case, but it's something that we need to continue engaging and researching. But I think we must bring that issue of ownership of these IPPs into the realm of the public. So there's one point that one wants to raise. The second point is IPPs are very expensive. They make profits, but that profit is made out of customers, clients, residents, households buying electricity at very inflated prices and tariffs. So what was the problem that we had with the IPPs? Now, the key point that from Makoma that's coming up, which is how do we make sure that many people are involved in the debate and the struggles around climate change, including the water issues. Currently now, I can tell you, it's a little, very few people who are involved. So we need to devise means of taking the work and the struggles we need to be engaging around these issues to the general public, including the trade unions particularly. The Federation, you mentioned them in the opening and in the trade unions. How are we taking this matter to the trade unions? NUMSA is that responsibility as part of the trade union movement and civil society. So, but I mean, this issue is not going to find any traction if we don't include, the workers. And the point that we raise is going to the media, particularly the radios. Discussions there, question and answer issues, but so that we make sure that people are getting to be aware of the issues. We won't be able to build any movement, any mobilization, if we don't sufficiently educate the working class about these issues. They will stay in the seminars and in workshops. So I think the call and the challenge is to take the struggle out there into our own communities.
I just want to make a comment on the general theme of all of this about the struggles. It's often a lack of democracy. It's a lack of democracy. We understand it as that. Vishwas, we've said it, but perhaps a market democracy. Democracy for the corporates, democracy for the 5%. And I think a lot of what we have to do perhaps is in our own communities unpack democracy, because people think they're going to vote every 5 years. You have a choice, right? At the end of the day, there's no choice between the DA, the ANC, the EFF, and the UDM. They're all captured by power and by capital, right? And the very reason why apartheid was overthrown was through people's power. And people think that power lies in them in a way that they're not these days. I think that that's an issue that we somehow have to bring down into our community and get the message across. And the other thing I want to just mention is that when we're talking about building a movement from below, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of time, and voluntary work to do this. And often you find that in our communities, people are not receptive to this kind of thing. It's just too hard work. They'd rather be bribed. Or in the case of our poor, in my area, they're just too busy, getting from work, coming home, putting food on the table, back to work the next day. And yet, often in those communities, in our organization, they're the most responsive to meetings and stuff. And I think often activists are also captured with the way they also work, is that they attend these kind of gatherings, they go home, and the information sits with them. They don't really disseminate the information down with the people they work with. And they try to also sometimes avoid the politics of this. You see? So it's more about less grow some veggies, and save the world, right? And the politics is completely out of the window. And so we don't educating the people on the ground about the consequences of all of this. And I think that kind of talks to why a lot of our community struggles are not uniting, because activists are what they call gatekeepers in the communities. And I think we need to move also beyond that. Maybe we should be looking at how to develop a workshop around building, ethical activists, or giving them the tools to become better activists, And really, there should be no activists really. There should be active citizens at the end of the day. I just want to throw that in.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to raise, somebody spoke about the other side of the carbon budgets, the capture. And what I want to talk about is the carbon capture part. And I think this is a really, really worrying factor. In KwaZulu-Natal, northern KwaZulu-Natal, there's a pilot project about the process of being formulated. It's been taken out to the local communities and that to look at carbon capture deep underground. It's taking the pollution from other areas and putting it into a deep rural area. And the process, some people are going to benefit enormously out of this, because approximately 22 million rand has been set aside. It's been through the cabinet clusters in KZN, and there's some of their consultation documents. They talk about consultation with civil society groups involved. In their stakeholder analysis, I saw very little consultation. It was more local authorities, local traditional authorities, wherever it's happened, very little consultation with the broader public. The other thing that's worrying is that this is a precursor, because this methodology is used by the oil industry and gas industry to pump in the North Sea, to extend the life of the gas fields and the oil fields in these areas and other areas of the world where there's other fossil fuel explorations. So they're taking the fossil fuels from our coal, toxic industries, and then pumping it underground. Now the idea of this pilot project is to see how it's going to function on land, because they can't do that kind of monitoring at sea. But what are the impacts to the downstream communities that are not benefiting out of this? Only a few select people in a small community are going to, if this goes ahead, will benefit. I think, comrades, we need to be aware of these kind of things where it's not happening from, it's happening here in South Africa. It's nothing, and they're going to claim the kudos at the end of the day that, hey, we've created X amount of things, jobs out of this. But it's not jobs. It's poisoning our soil. It's poisoning our water. Because that, like the fracking, is going to have an impact on our water table. I'm not a rocket scientist, but you can work out what's going to happen in the long term. And I'd just like to know the panel's thinking on that kind of processes.
So we're really eating into our lunch time. So maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Thanks very much. I think I agree with Comrade Hassan on the language that we use. Comrade Vish just used a big word now, I can't pronounce it. And I think many of ordinary people thank you very much. I'm saying I agree with Comrade Hassan around the language that we use, because it's this language that creates barriers for people to be able to understand what actually is happening. You don't need to be a scientist to understand that climate change is upon us. Your everyday experiences will reflect that it's very difficult for you to access food. You can't even plant your own. You can't, even if you have a small plot, but we have problems in growing your vegetables because of lack of water and the soil quality tells us there's something that is happening. So you don't really need to be a scientist to understand that. But the language that is being used, it's the language that creates barriers for most people to understand exactly what is happening. I don't understand most of the big words. I've just tried to understand, but not even try to pronounce them, because I know every time when I speak to people, I need to use accessible language, and particularly not even English, but most of our indigenous languages, to explain to people or to share information with people as to what really is happening around us. So if we can, and I think this has been something that has been discussed, particularly with the climate justice now and the energy sector movement in the country for at least more than 12 years that I've been part of, that language has been a barrier, and we need to be careful how we talk about things. You don't have to go to greater lengths to explain to a person about how climate change impacts on them. Everyday struggles of a person for access to food, water, and stuff, you can link that to the phenomenon of climate change and the science of climate change, and people will be able to understand. What can we do to force implementation of so much that is on paper that is so good? There is no clear-cut answer. There's no clear-cut strategy. We have different strategies which we feel comfortable in applying, which we think are working. Ferrier has just indicated that she doesn't see the value of civil society going through to COP. The others are seeing the value, others are not seeing the value. But what is important, I think, for us is to hold those that we have put in position of power accountable. And how do we put them accountable? We can do that in various ways. Other people would rather go to their offices and expose them. Other people would rather go and block their entrances so that they can think clearly and have time to think with no interference during the day of people coming in and going out. Others prefer to simply have engagements with them. So holding those that you put in power accountable, it can be done in multiple ways. I think as part of the history that we have at Earthlife is that we have used multiple or multi-strategies over the 30 years organizational existence, and we're saying not any of them is correct. But now lately, which is not now lately, at least we have litigation as part of the strategy. It's not the first time we used litigation around late 90s and early 2000s, when most civil society organizations were saying, you guys are crazy, you can't use litigation to hold people accountable. That was around the Pebble Bay nuclear reactor and the Thor Chemicals story issue in KZN, in Captain Parakinos and Captain Parakinos KZN. And that is a strategy. It is KZN. Yeah, that was a strategy that was not really popular by then, but the aim of the strategy was to hold those that are in power accountable, because we want to do the injustices that were upon us. And you rightly have corrected the issue. You pointed out on the nuclear procurement case, which was also for us saying we have a beautiful constitution, you violating the legislation, you're violating regulations and policies that are contained there. So we're holding from the state president accountable up until to the national energy regulator, ESCOM, everyone that is in position of power to say, you can't do this. So that was part of the strategy of holding them accountable. And also last year, we held the Minister of Environment accountable over climate change impacts assessment, because she was going ahead and authorizing coal-fired power plants without having seen whether there's climate change impact assessments done for those plants for their lifespan. So in a way, for us to protect our future, protect our climate, our water, we use also part of the strategies to hold those that are in power accountable through litigation.
Let's talk a bit more over lunch. Just to respond on the one thing. From the point of view of the regulator, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, a community-based, socially owned electricity project that produces power, the regulator will treat them as an independent power producer. So, when that term is used in that sort of space, it's used slightly differently to when it's used in other spaces. But I don't disagree with you about the problems we have with the way that the procurement has been done, but language can be challenging in that it gets used differently in different contexts. So maybe what we do need to emphasize, though, is just what forms of ownership we consider acceptable and what forms of ownership or procurement, and particularly the role that the financial sector plays, is not acceptable. Not least because, in fact, under the procurement of renewable power, we do at least see what rate of return investors are being allowed on their investment. Now, I'm not saying that they're not hiding stuff and fudging stuff and that it's not more than what they say it is, but it has been more transparent than the costs we incur through ESCOM and they're buying coal wherever they feel like it from whoever they feel like it from or whatever. So, you know, in terms of transparency, I think that's what we should be demanding for all public service provision, is that we do get disclosure of the rates of return that go to the financial sector and maybe get to put a squeeze on them in one way or another. Because what's happened in the past has not been transparent and we don't really know where all the costs have gone, but it's certainly served to enrich a small minority on that side. Yes, we absolutely need active citizenry, and I would include in that saying we should all be encouraging people wherever possible to try and use the integrated development planning processes provided for in the Constitution. It is thankless work. It can be, last time I went to a meeting, nobody even pitched from the city of Johannesburg. They announced a meeting for consultations on the IDP. Nobody was there. So I'm not suggesting that this is a silver bullet, but it is something provided in our Constitution, and the only way that we're really going to have the sort of society we want with inclusive decision making, with people having access to resources, is through integrated planning with the participation of people in democratic means. So that's, for the short term, all we can really hope for from that process is to try and stimulate it to be taken seriously and to start doing it properly. It's not going to give us the traction we need, but I do think it's nevertheless important because I can't see us coming right without it over the long term. Even though for some of the short-term changes, I fully agree we must do more picketing and more protesting, but we do have a pretty authoritarian state right now. So, you know, one needs to really think carefully and be responsible about it. If there's going to be a demo, let's make sure we've got plenty of cameras in place so that any misbehavior by the police, they know that they're being watched, that it's on record. But I do think we need more direct action, and that's where maybe you have one or two people who are styled as activists because they've really been trained in how to behave in a non-violent manner. Because you don't want someone going along to a demo who hasn't got much self-discipline and they say they're part of a non-violent action and then they lash out at someone. And it can totally undermine the whole point. So we do need non-violence training for activists, I believe. And I use the word activist there not as this is the only people who are really activists, but the people who are specifically trained to be very, very, very disciplined in undertaking acts of civil disobedience. And then just on the CCS, carbon capture and storage, Brian was saying there's a pilot project in KZN. I'm actually not too worried about that. They said they were going to sink the test well back in 2016. They still haven't done it. They're fiddling about. It's the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum. We got a mandate some 12 years ago, and they've still got budget, they're spending it. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm much more concerned about what's happening with the gas infrastructure, because that is seeking to make a big investment in infrastructure which is premised on fracking the Karoo. So at this stage, they're not saying they're going to frack the Karoo because they're not sure if there's gas there, and they haven't got enough information to be able to make a strong case for it. But they are saying we should put gas infrastructure in place on the assumption that there is gas there that we can get out in a responsible manner. And once they've got all the gas infrastructure, they're going to say, well, we've got to use the gas in the Karoo because otherwise all this infrastructure is wasted. So they're really trying to get us into this bind, and the Integrated Resource Plan for Electricity has a big whack of gas in it from 2025. They want to use gas for other things as well. And you know, given that we've got a gas pipeline coming in from Mozambique, there may be some applications where substituting coal with gas could be a good thing. But that doesn't mean that making more gas infrastructure, making more financial commitments to gas is a good thing, because for the most part, gas is only slightly less of a greenhouse gas source than coal. It doesn't have the same local pollution impacts, so it is significantly different, but it's not something, and certainly not if we're going to have to import it. So yes, they're piddling on with carbon capture and storage. They're doing some things which they could do much better things with those resources and they could do it better. But that's an old mandate, and I mean, Sasol has stopped trying to do it. And if anyone was going to try and make a case for carbon capture and storage, it was Sasol, because they have a high CO2 stream already coming out of their plant. So for them, it would be the most attractive. They're not even bothering with it anymore because they don't, because of the costs that are involved. So this pilot project, I think, is just there because nobody wanted to give the money back. They were having fun and they wanted to go and dig their hole. If they start putting in liquid natural gas landing facilities, I think that's going to be more of a problem.
It's south of there, and it's going to happen. It's people are dying. They spoke about it.
Briefly, I'll just make 3 quick points. We're living in a time where sort of post-truth politics, anti-intellectualism, populism is prevailing. And we really must combat that in all our spaces, in all our politics, in all our movements, because it's an unthinking politics. I personally reject it with the contempt it deserves. But I do think that every movement and every activist must master 3 forms of knowledge. Now, I've been an activist for about 36 or more years of my life, and a big part of that has been doing popular education, including working with NUMSA and others. The first kind of knowledge we all must master and be in tune with is the lived experience of people, okay? And it's the common sense knowledge, where they see the pain, they see the suffering, they live it, and so on. We must start there. The other type of knowledge is tacit knowledge, or popular knowledge, where we know how it works. We reach a point as an activist where we can see how the system is working, okay? We know that it's capitalism squeezing us, it's extracting profit, etc. That's the popular knowledge. And a good movement will have popular knowledge, it will build that capacity, and so on. But there's a third kind of knowledge, and that is critical, if you want to call it scientific knowledge as well, which is a bit more deeper, okay? Where you're really asking the deeper questions about explanation, about concepts and ideas and so on. And every good activist must master all 3 kinds of knowledge. And that's my appeal to you as well. In the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, we work with all 3 kinds of knowledge. It's driven by the lived experience of activists who are feeding people, who are running gardens, etc. We have popular knowledge. All our tools are about popular knowledge, where we say, let's understand what's causing the water problem. Let's understand what's causing the hunger problem. That's our popular knowledge. But then we also have deeper conversations. And deeper knowledge, I mean, the book I just flashed up on the climate crisis is a deeper attempt to think about the political economy of climate change. So, in my view, and from my own limited experience, I would appeal to activists to master all 3 forms of knowledge, even in your movement. And movements are doing it. And I agree with Hassan. Movements are doing it, and we must celebrate that if it's being done. We must invite that in and learn from that. I think that's very, very important. The second quick point I want to make is just around the question of reaching citizens and developing a kind of mass narrative and a mass message and so on. So the one thing we have going for us is climate shock. So we have this climate shock, we have this drought. So talking to comrades from Cape Town, I mean, they're in the room too. They're alive to how these things connect up, okay? People are moving in response to this shock, to this lived experience, okay? We're going to have more droughts and more shocks. We're going to have heat waves. We're going to have floods. So climate determinism is going to play its part. But the danger with us relying on climate determinism to move society is that it will be too late, okay? And that is why we've got to get organized. And that is why we've got to start building the bridges. And we've got to start reaching out. And we've got to start uniting. And we've got to start building a movement, or alliances, if you like, and a common platform, which then can, if you like, be used to engage society more broadly. So from it, the unions have an entry point. I know NUMSA has done amazing work on climate issues. You'll have had conferences, you'll have had study tours, you'll have had amazing policy interventions and so on. Others are doing similar work. Everyone's finding the entry point into this issue, and that is amazing. But again, I think what we are trying to say here today and tomorrow and in our ongoing interactions is let's try and connect this up, okay? Because together we can do much more to shift society. Together we can, if you like, unleash a powerful message. But individually, alone, we're not going to be able to have that kind of impact. My last point is this. Not all academics are progressive people. We've got to be very clear about that. I'm an academic, I know. And we are trying to, one of the exceptions, we're trying this place. We're trying to shift this institution right now to become an ecocentric institution, to become a zero waste institution, zero carbon, zero hunger institution. I mean, you'll interact with our process tomorrow as well. It's not an easy process. Exaro, the mining company, invests in WITS. It has research agendas here at WITS around coal mining. This university developed out of mining, the mining industry. There are powerful interests shaping this university. Okay? So it's a contested space. But what we are trying to do though, and this has got to do with the fact that we have to build a mass politics around climate. Our calculation is if you can move a big institution like a university with 35,000 people, you can display climate leadership in South Africa. You can show society another way forward. So imagine we shift all 26 universities in the direction of the kind of climate charter, climate justice politics we all want. That's a powerful, symbolic, powerful political message.